The letter showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, folded neatly, no warning, no knock at the door. Just an envelope tucked between grocery flyers and a water bill, like it belonged there, like it was normal. I didn't even open it right away. I set it on the kitchen table, the same oak table my family has eaten at for generations, and went to make coffee. If I'd known what was inside, I probably would have sat down first. When I finally opened it, the first thing I saw wasn't my name. It was a number, a bold one, $12,000. That alone made my stomach drop. But then I read the sentence underneath it, slowly, twice, because my brain refused to accept it the first time. It said the Homeowners Association was placing a lien on my property, not fining me, not warning me, not asking for payment. A lien. On my house. I actually laughed at first, out loud. A short, confused laugh, the kind you make when something is so ridiculous it feels like a joke you don't understand yet. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be filming me. I've lived in this house my entire life. My parents lived here. Their parents lived here. This place was already standing when Ulysses S. Grant was still alive. The idea that an HOA, something that didn't even exist for most of this country's history, could claim any authority over it felt absurd. But the laughter didn't last long. I kept reading. According to the letter, my property was in serious violation of community standards. According to the letter, I had failed to pay mandatory HOA dues. According to the letter, the association had the legal right to recover those dues by attaching a lien to my home, which could ultimately lead to foreclosure if left unresolved. Foreclosure. On a house built in 1869. I sat down. Slowly this time. This house existed before the HOA, before the subdivision around it, before the streets had names, before zoning maps, before indoor plumbing, before electricity, which is ironic, because I spent my entire career wiring places like this one, making sure history didn't burn itself down. This home was built by my great-grandmother with hand-cut lumber and iron nails. The deed is older than the city hall. The property lines were drawn when this was still considered the edge of town. And yet here was a letter printed on crisp white paper, telling me that a group formed in the 1980s now had the right to decide whether I got to keep it. The more I read, the worse it got. They weren't just claiming unpaid dues. They were claiming I had agreed to them, that I was a member, that I had signed documents binding my property to the HOA's authority, that I had accepted their rules, their fines, their enforcement powers. I hadn't. I never had. I don't attend HOA meetings. I don't vote. I don't use their facilities. I don't even acknowledge their existence beyond a polite wave when someone walks past the fence. For decades, my property was treated as separate, because it is separate. Everyone knew that. Or at least, they used to. But the letter didn't care about what was known. It cared about what it claimed. And then I reached the part that made my hands start shaking. The lien amount wasn't $12,000 anymore. That was just the beginning. Late fees, penalties, legal costs, administrative charges, all neatly stacked on top of each other, like bricks in a wall being built around my house. The total climbed with every paragraph, and at the bottom, written in the calm, professional tone of someone who knows they're holding all the cards, was the sentence that changed everything. Failure to comply may result in loss of property, not may result in additional fines, not may result in court action. Loss of property. They weren't asking for money. They were asking for my house. I looked up from the paper and stared at the walls. The crown molding my wife restored by hand. The floorboards worn smooth by 5 generations of footsteps. The staircase that still creaks on the 3rd step because it always has. Every corner of this place holds a memory. Birthdays, funerals, holidays, quiet nights, loud arguments, apologies, forgiveness. A lifetime stacked on top of another lifetime, all contained within these walls. And some HOA I never joined was telling me they could take it. At that moment, the shock gave way to something colder. Fear, yes, but also disbelief. Because for this to be real, for this to even be possible, something fundamental would have to be broken. Laws, records, history itself. You don't just wake up one day and discover your home has been claimed by an organization that didn't exist when your grandparents were alive. So I went back to the top of the letter and started over, slower this time. I read every word, every citation, every reference to bylaws and statutes and sections of documents I had supposedly signed. And that's when one detail stood out. Attached to the notice was a copy of the document they were using to justify everything. A membership agreement. It had my property address on it, my name typed neatly at the top, and at the bottom a signature. Not mine. It was my grandmother's name. She died in 1982. The date next to her signature was 1984. I stared at it for a long time, long enough for the coffee to go cold, long enough for the house to settle around me the way old houses do, with soft pops and sighs. According to this document, my grandmother had signed away the rights to this property 2 years after she was buried. That's when the disbelief turned into something else entirely, because documents don't just appear out of nowhere. Someone made this. Someone printed it. Someone decided to put that signature on that line and send it to me, fully expecting that I would panic, pay up, or walk away quietly. And suddenly, this wasn't just about an HOA overstepping its bounds. It was about a piece of paper that couldn't legally exist, and someone who was counting on me not noticing that fact. People hear the word house and think of square footage, resale value, curb appeal. They think of walls and roofs and tax assessments. That's never what this place was to me. This wasn't something my family bought. It was something they built piece by piece when there was nothing else around it. Before paved roads, before streetlights, before anyone thought land like this would ever be worth fighting over. My great-grandmother broke ground here in 1869, not with contractors or blueprints, but with family. Her brothers cut the timber. Neighbors helped raise the frame. The foundation stones were hauled by hand from the creek a mile away. There's a ledger in the attic that lists the cost of nails, written in careful cursive, each entry dated and initialed. I've held it in my hands. The ink has faded, but the intention hasn't. This house was meant to last. It did. 5 generations later, the beams are still solid. The staircase still leans ever so slightly to the left, because it always has. The windows are tall and narrow, built to catch cross breezes in a time before fans. When the afternoon sun it's the parlor just right. The light spills across the floor exactly the way it did in photographs from the early 1900s. You don't replace things like that. You take care of them. That's what my wife understood better than anyone. Sarah didn't just live here, she loved this house. When we got married, some people suggested we move somewhere newer, somewhere easier. She smiled and said no. She said history mattered. She said places carry stories, and if you abandon them, you lose more than wood and plaster. So she spent years restoring what time had worn down. Not modernizing. Restoring. She stripped layers of paint off the banister until the original grain reappeared. She tracked down period-correct hardware at estate sales and antique shops. She learned how to repair old plaster instead of tearing it out. On weekends, she'd be in the garden, tending roses planted decades before either of us were born, talking to them like they could hear her. Maybe they could. They're still blooming. When she got sick, she asked me to promise something, not about money, not about possessions. She asked me to promise I wouldn't let the house be stripped of what made it itself. She said, this place outlived everyone who built it. Let it outlive us too. I promised. I meant it. So when that letter talked about foreclosure like it was just another administrative step, it felt obscene, like someone casually suggesting you erase a family photograph because the frame doesn't match their decor. Losing this house wouldn't just mean packing boxes and finding somewhere else to sleep. It would mean breaking a chain that survived wars, depressions, and generations of people who understood that ownership isn't just about legal title. It's about stewardship. My parents are buried not far from here. So are my grandparents. My grandmother's hands once scrubbed these same floors. My grandfather repaired the roof after a storm using techniques taught to him by his father. Every mark, every imperfection tells a story. If this place is taken, those stories don't move with me. They disappear. That's what the letter didn't understand. Or maybe it did, and that's why it was written the way it was. Cold, efficient, stripped of humanity. It treated my home like an asset on a spreadsheet, something to be leveraged, something to be transferred. I walked through the rooms after reading it, touching the walls, the door frames, the old light fixtures I rewired myself years ago to keep everything safe without changing how it looked. I could still hear Sarah laughing when the power flickered the first time after I finished that job, proud that the lights stayed on. I could still picture my mother standing at the sink, looking out the same window at the yard when it was half the size it is now. What would it mean to lose that? It would mean more than displacement. It would mean erasure, the kind that happens quietly, without anyone noticing until it's too late. A historic home sold, updated, stripped of character, divided or demolished. Another story replaced with vinyl siding and uniformity. Another piece of the past paved over because it was inconvenient. And all of this over rules I never agreed to. That's when the anger started to creep in. Not loud anger, not shouting anger, the slow, focused kind. Because the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't some misunderstanding about paperwork or dues. This wasn't about compliance or community standards or lawn height or mailbox colors. Those were excuses. What they wanted was land. This property sits on a corner that developers have eyed for years. It doesn't fit neatly into the grid around it. It interrupts their symmetry. It reminds people that the neighborhood wasn't always theirs to organize. And now, suddenly, there was an HOA claiming authority, waving documents that ignored history, dates, reality itself. They weren't enforcing rules. They were trying to take something that couldn't be replaced. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules at all. It was about taking something they wanted. The next letter arrived less than a week later. This one didn't mention the lien at all. It talked about my lawn. According to the notice, the grass along the west side of my property exceeded the maximum allowable height. There was a grainy photo attached, taken from the sidewalk, zoomed in so tightly it cut off the rest of the yard. A red line had been drawn over the image, measuring from soil to blade. I went outside with a ruler. It was off by nearly an inch. I trimmed it anyway. I told myself this was how these things worked: bureaucracy, overreach, someone pushing paper without context. I didn't want trouble. I wanted quiet. So I complied. 2 days later, another notice showed up. This time it was about my mailbox. Apparently, the color didn't conform to community standards. It had been the same dark green for decades, longer than the HOA itself had existed. The notice included a deadline, a fine if missed, and a reminder that continued non-compliance could escalate enforcement actions. I painted the mailbox. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Once the notices started, they didn't stop. They multiplied. 1 week it was the fence, which they claimed was an inch too close to the sidewalk. The next week it was the porch railing, which they said didn't meet updated safety guidelines, even though it had been standing since the 1920s without incident. One letter contradicted another. One inspector flagged something as a violation that a different inspector had approved just days earlier. There was no consistency, only pressure. I started noticing the timing. Notices arrived early in the week, giving just enough time to induce stress, but not enough to resolve anything without rearranging my life. Inspections happened without warning. I'd look out the window and see someone standing at the edge of my property with a clipboard, a camera, sometimes a measuring tape. They never knocked. They never spoke to me unless I approached them first. When I did, they were polite, too polite, the kind of politeness that feels rehearsed. They'd say things like, "We're just doing our job," or "These are the rules," as if that explained everything. As if rules exist in a vacuum, detached from fairness or history or common sense. They'd refer to the board without naming names, like the authority behind them was abstract and unquestionable. Eventually a name did surface. Not at first. First it was a title, HOA President. Then later, in smaller print on one of the notices, a signature block. Only then did the name become visible. I didn't know anything about her yet, just that she'd signed off on Eve. Escalation. What struck me wasn't the severity of any single violation. It was the accumulation. Each fine was small enough to seem manageable. $50, $100, $200 with administrative fees. But they stacked, and they stacked quickly. Miss one deadline because you're fixing another issue, and the penalties doubled. Appeal a violation, and the clock kept ticking while your appeal waited for review. It felt designed that way. The humiliations were subtle but constant. Notices taped to the front gate where passers-by could see them. Photos taken from odd angles to exaggerate imperfections. Inspectors crouching down to measure cracks in the sidewalk, as if looking for something, anything, to justify another citation. Once, I came home to find chalk marks on the edge of my driveway, little symbols only they understood. I started keeping a folder, then a box. Every letter, every photo, every envelope. Dates, times, names when I could get them. I told myself it was just to stay organized, but part of me knew I was preparing for something bigger. What really changed things was a conversation over the fence. Martha, who lives 2 houses down, had always been friendly. We'd exchange greetings, talk about the weather, nothing more. One afternoon, she asked if I'd been having trouble too. Her voice dropped when she said it, like she didn't want the words to carry. She told me about the fines. Different ones, different reasons. But the same pattern. Notices that didn't make sense. Inspections that contradicted each other. Pressure to comply quickly or face escalating costs. She said she felt watched. Like any small mistake would be turned into leverage. He wasn't the only one. Once I started listening, the stories came out quietly. Robert across the street had been cited for a shed that predated the HOA's architectural guidelines. Dorothy on the corner received notices about her garden boundaries shifting from one inspection to the next. Each of them thought it was just happening to them, that they were being singled out for some reason they didn't understand. None of us realized it was happening to all of us. What we did notice was who it seemed to happen to the most. Older residents. People who'd lived here a long time. People on fixed incomes. People less likely to fight back loudly. The violations were rarely catastrophic. They didn't need to be. They just needed to be persistent. And there was always a solution offered, just beneath the surface. Sometimes it came in the form of a suggestion. Some people find it easier to sell rather than deal with all this. Sometimes it was more explicit. A flyer slipped into a mailbox advertising fast cash offers for homes in the area. Convenient. Timely. I started paying attention to what happened next. A house would get hit with fines, then more fines, then legal letters. Then, eventually, a for sale sign would appear. Not always public. Sometimes it was quiet, off-market. A quick transaction. And then, within months, the house would be renovated and relisted at a much higher price, or rented out by a company none of us recognized. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet, but it was a pattern. The HOA meetings didn't help. They were tense, formal, and carefully controlled. Public comment was limited, questions were redirected, concerns were noted, and then I ignored. The board spoke in broad terms about maintaining standards and protecting property values. No one addressed the inconsistencies. No one explained why rules seemed to shift depending on who was being inspected, and every time someone pushed back, the response was the same: more scrutiny, more notices, more pressure. I began to understand the machine for what it was, not one big dramatic act, but a series of small ones, each one deniable, each one justifiable on paper, together, overwhelming, exhausting, designed to wear people down until the easiest option was to give up. That's what made it dangerous, because this wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't even about my house. It was about an environment where authority was applied selectively, where rules were flexible tools rather than consistent standards, and where the end result always seemed to benefit the same side. Every fine pushed people closer to selling, and someone was always ready to buy. I went back to the paperwork when the house was quiet. Late evening, no distractions. The kind of time where details don't slip past you because you're tired or rushed. I spread everything out across the dining room table. Letters, notices, copies of alleged agreements, fine schedules, photographs. It looked excessive laid out like that, but something told me it was necessary. At first glance, the lien paperwork looked official. That's what makes documents like this dangerous. Clean formatting, legal language, references to statutes and bylaws. Most people don't have the time or energy to look up. It's designed to make you feel small, uninformed, already behind. Designed to make you assume someone else has done their homework. So I decided to do mine. I started with the basics: names, addresses, dates. I read every page slowly, not for what it claimed, but for how it claimed it. There's a rhythm to legitimate paperwork, a consistency. When something is assembled carelessly or retroactively, it often shows in small ways. The first thing I noticed was the date on the lien itself. It referenced unpaid dues going back several years, but the enforcement language cited bylaws that, according to the fine print, had only been amended recently. That wasn't necessarily wrong, but it was odd. Retroactive enforcement is possible in some cases, but it's not common, and it usually comes with additional disclosures. None were included. Then there was the membership agreement again, the one with my grandmother's name on it. I placed it side by side with a copy of her actual signature, taken from an old family document. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to scream forgery at a glance, but it wasn't subtle either. The loops were too uniform, the pressure too even. Real handwriting changes with age, health, mood. This signature didn't. Still, I reminded myself to stay calm. Assumptions don't help. Facts do. I looked at the date more closely. The agreement was supposedly signed in 1984. The HOA referenced in the document used a specific corporate name, complete with ink at the end. That caught my attention. Corporate names tend to evolve. I wondered when that exact name came into use. I made a note and moved on. The next inconsistency came from the language itself. Certain phrases felt modern, not legally modern, linguistically modern. Terms that didn't line with how homeowner associations typically wrote documents in the early 1980s. That alone didn't prove anything, but it added to the unease. Documents carry the fingerprints of their era. This one felt out of place. Then there were the attachments. One page referenced an architectural guideline manual that didn't appear anywhere else in the paperwork. Another cited a vote taken at a meeting I had no record of, despite the fact that meeting minutes are supposed to be publicly available. The more I cross-referenced, the more gaps appeared. Small ones, manageable ones, but too many to ignore. I paused and reminded myself to breathe. This wasn't a mystery novel. There didn't need to be a dramatic reveal. All I needed was clarity. Either this paperwork held up under scrutiny or it didn't. So I shifted tactics. Instead of analyzing what was present, I focused on what wasn't. There was no original deed attachment, no recorded covenant tying my property to the HOA, no clear explanation of how a home built in the 19th century became subject to a 20th century association without any transitional documentation. That kind of change doesn't happen invisibly. It leaves a trail, which meant there should be records. I pulled out my own documents next. The deed passed down through my family, the insurance paperwork, the restoration permits Sarah had filed years earlier. Everything told the same story. This property stood alone, always had. No mention of HOA obligations, no easements, no shared governance. I compared addresses, lot numbers, parcel identifiers. The HOA paperwork referenced a subdivision designation that didn't include my parcel. In one place, it did. In another, it didn't. The boundaries shifted depending on the context, like they were being adjusted to fit the argument rather than the reality. It didn't make sense. I didn't feel triumphant at that realization. I felt uneasy. Because confusion at this level doesn't happen by accident. It happens when documents are assembled quickly or carelessly, or with the assumption that no one will look too closely. I flipped back to the signature page again. The date, the witness line, the notary stamp. The notary commission number was visible. That surprised me. Notaries are traceable. Their commissions are public record. I wrote the number down. Then I noticed something else. The notary's commission expiration date was listed as 1986. That alone wasn't unusual, But the stamp style was. It included formatting elements I recognized from much later designs. Not impossible, but inconsistent. I added it to the list. At this point, the table was covered in sticky notes. Questions, not conclusions. I wasn't trying to prove wrongdoing. I was trying to understand how this paperwork existed at all. That's when the bigger question finally took shape. When exactly did this HOA come into existence? The documents assumed it had always been there, like an unchanging authority. But organizations don't appear out of thin air. They're formed, filed, registered, incorporated. Those actions create records, and records create timelines. If the HOA didn't exist at the time this agreement was supposedly signed, then nothing else mattered. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't call anyone. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply opened my laptop and went to the county website. Public records are rural, were glamorous. They're slow, clunky, buried behind outdated interfaces. But they're honest in a way few things are. They don't care about narratives. They care about dates and filings and stamps. I searched for the HOA by name, then by alternate names, then by partial names. There it was, an incorporation record, filed in 1985. I stared at the screen for a long time. The membership agreement was dated 1984. The HOA didn't legally exist until 1985. That didn't automatically mean everything was invalid. Sometimes associations operate informally before incorporation. Sometimes names change. Sometimes documents are updated later. But those situations leave explanations, amendments, ratifications, trails of paper connecting one thing to another. This didn't. The record showed a clean start. New entity, new board, new filings, no mention of earlier agreements, no grandfathered properties, no transitional clauses, nothing tying my address or my grandmother to anything before that date. I checked again, slower this time. Different database, same result. It didn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense in official records, it usually means one of two things. Either there's information missing, or the story being told doesn't match the reality that was filed. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the paperwork spread across the table again. What had felt overwhelming before now felt fragile, like a structure held together by assumptions rather than facts. I hadn't proven anything yet, not definitively. But I had reached the point where the questions were no longer about my compliance. They were about their claims. And that's when I decided to check the county records more thoroughly. The shift was subtle at first, but once it happened, there was no mistaking it. The tone of the letters changed. The language hardened. What had once been framed as notices and reminders became demands and final warnings. The HOA stopped pretending this was about minor compliance issues and started acting like an adversary that had decided it was done negotiating. The first legal letter arrived by certified mail. That alone sent a message. It wasn't taped to the gate or slipped into a mailbox. It required a signature, proof of receipt, proof that I couldn't claim ignorance later. The envelope was thicker than the others, heavier with implication. Inside was a notice from an attorney representing the HOA, outlining my ongoing failure to resolve outstanding violations and warning that further action would be taken if immediate payment was not made. They referenced the lien again, this time more aggressively. The amount had grown, fees layered on top of fees, justified by vague administrative language. The letter didn't accuse me of anything explicitly. It didn't threaten me directly. It didn't have to. It simply laid out a process and implied what would happen if I didn't fall in line. Foreclosure was no longer implied. It was mentioned. Still, I tried to stay grounded. Legal letters are designed to intimidate. I knew that. I'd spent enough time around contracts and regulations in my working life to recognize pressure tactics, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I tried to hire a lawyer. That's when the isolation began. The first firm I called declined politely. Conflict of interest, they said. The second didn't return. End my call. The third told me, after a brief consultation, that they couldn't represent me because they already did work for the HOA. Then another, and another. Some were apologetic, some were curt. A few were evasive. After the fifth rejection, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The HOA had already been there. They had retained counsel broadly, preemptively. Large firms, small firms, anyone local and affordable. Anyone who might realistically take my case. It didn't matter if those firms had never interacted with me before. Once they had advised or represented the HOA in any capacity, they were conflicted out. I expanded my search radius, called firms farther away. The responses grew more hesitant. HOA cases, I was told, were complicated, expensive, time-consuming. Some lawyers hinted that associations with deep pockets and aggressive boards weren't worth fighting unless you had significant resources of your own. I didn't. By the time the next letter arrived, the stress had started to settle into my body. Sleep became shallow. My thoughts circled endlessly, replaying conversations, rereading documents in my head. Every sound outside made me look up. Every car slowing near the house felt intentional. I caught myself standing at the window more often than I wanted to admit. Then came the visits. HOA representatives began showing up more frequently, always during business hours, always with clipboards, sometimes with someone new in tow. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't step onto the porch unless invited. They stood just inside the property line and spoke in calm, measured tones, reminding me of deadlines, asking if I had made arrangements. Once, one of them mentioned how stressful these situations could be, especially for someone living alone. The comment wasn't overt. It didn't need to be. It landed exactly where it was intended to. Another time, someone suggested I might want to think about my long-term plans. They said it like advice, like concern, like they were doing me a favor by pointing out how exhausting this must be. The pressure wasn't loud. It was constant. The foreclosure language became more specific. Dates were introduced, processes explained. It was framed as inevitable if I didn't comply. The implication was clear. This wasn't going away. It would only get worse. Every path forward seemed to lead to the same outcome, unless I gave them what they wanted. And then there was the money. Even without paying the fines, the costs were adding up. Certified mail fees, copying documents, taking time off to attend hearings and inspections, considering legal consultations I couldn't afford to pursue. It wasn't just emotional pressure anymore. It was financial strain, tightening slowly, deliberately. There were nights I sat at the same dining table where I'd once spread out paperwork with clarity and purpose, now staring at it with a knot in my chest. I thought about what would happen if I lost. Where would I go? What would happen to the house, to Sarah's work, to the promise I made? I thought about how easily this could end if I just signed something, agreed to a payment plan, acknowledged the HOA's authority for now, deferred the fight, bought myself peace even temporarily. That's what they were counting on. The doubt crept in quietly, not all at once. It arrived in questions. What if I was NG? What if there was some obscure legal mechanism I didn't understand? What if fighting this cost more than it was worth? What if the stress itself was doing more damage than losing the house would? For the first time since this started, I considered the possibility that they might actually win. That thought scared me more than any letter. Because it wasn't about losing an argument anymore. It was about losing everything that anchored me. The house wasn't just where I lived, it was where I remembered who I was. Without it, I wasn't sure what would be left besides boxes and regret. The isolation made it worse. Friends listened sympathetically but didn't know how to help. Neighbors were dealing with their own issues, afraid to draw attention to themselves. Every professional door I knocked on seemed to close before I could step through. The HOA, meanwhile, moved forward with confidence. Their communications were efficient, timely, backed by resources I didn't have. They acted like the outcome was already decided, like this was just a matter of paperwork catching up to reality. I could feel the walls closing in. And yet, beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was something else, a quiet refusal, a sense that if I gave in now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd held on just a little longer. That was the moment everything hung in the balance. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic phone call or a sudden revelation. It came quietly, the way real change often does, through a conversation that almost didn't happen. I was outside one afternoon, going through the motions of another inspection notice, measuring, inting, trying to stay ahead of whatever the next issue would be. I didn't notice someone standing at the edge of the fence until they cleared their throat. It was Dorothy from the corner house, retired, soft-spoken, the kind of neighbor who always seemed to know when a package had been delivered or a storm was coming before anyone else did. She asked how I was holding up. I gave the kind of answer people give when they don't want to invite more questions. Managing. She nodded, like she understood exactly what that meant. Then she said something that stopped me cold. I think they tried the same thing with me, she said, years ago. It didn't work then. It shouldn't work now. That was the first time anyone had spoken about this as something larger than my situation. Not sympathy, recognition. Dorothy had kept everything, letters, notices, meeting agendas. She'd never needed them before, but she'd never thrown them away either. Old habits from a lifetime spent around books and records. She invited me over later that evening, and when I sat at her dining table, I saw a familiar sight, stacks of paper, neatly organized, labeled by date. The patterns were there. Different addresses, different violations, the same language, the same escalation, the same deadlines, the same suggestions tucked gently into conversations and correspondence that life would be easier if she simply moved on. What stopped it back then, she told me, was a document, not a lawyer, not a confrontation, a document that contradicted everything the HOA claimed. She didn't have it anymore, but she remembered it existed. That was enough. Around the same time, another neighbor, Robert, started asking questions of his own. He'd noticed inspectors lingering longer near certain properties. He'd noticed contracts being awarded to familiar names. Landscaping, towing, repairs, always the same companies, always connected to someone on the board or someone related to someone on the board. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything, he was just noticing. And then there was Martha. She'd finally spoken to a professional friend of hers, someone who specialized in property records and association governance. Not a lawyer offering representation, just someone willing to look at documents and timelines and tell her if they made sense. They didn't. What none of us had alone, we began to have together. Perspective, cross-references, context, a way to see the bigger picture without jumping to conclusions. The breakthrough came from something deceptively simple, a survey. Robert mentioned almost offhandedly that the HOA clubhouse always felt oddly placed, too close to my property line, too close for comfort. It had been there for years, so no one questioned it. But when we pulled the original plats and overlaid them with current boundaries, the alignment didn't add up. I ordered a professional survey, not because I expected anything dramatic, but because I needed clarity. When the surveyor came back, his expression was neutral, professional, but his words were precise. The structure extended onto my parcel, not by inches, by feet. That fact alone didn't solve everything. Property boundary disputes can be complicated. Easements exist. Mistakes happen. But there was no easement recorded, no agreement, no documentation granting permission. The HOA structure was, at least on paper, partially on land it didn't own. That changed the conversation. At the same time, Dorothy managed to locate the document she'd remembered. An old insurance policy rider attached to her deed from decades earlier, referencing properties in the area that predated the HOA. It outlined exclusions, protections, limitations on association authority. It wasn't specific to my house alone, but it established a precedent. Not every property was automatically subject to HOA control, regardless of proximity or later development. When we compared it to my deed, the language aligned. Then there was the conflict issue. Again, no accusations, just facts. Board members approving contracts, companies benefiting repeatedly, relationships disclosed vaguely, if at all. It wasn't illegal on its face, but it raised questions. Questions that required transparency, questions the HOA hadn't been eager to answer. The most important discovery, though, was still the simplest one: the lien authority itself. The professional Martha consulted confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Even if the HOA had authority over certain properties, liens weren't automatic. They required specific conditions, proper notice, valid membership, clear documentation tying the property to the association's governance. Without that, the lien was just a claim, not a fact. And in my case, the chain linking my property to that authority was broken at multiple points. We didn't celebrate. Not yet. Nothing had been resolved. But for the first time in months, I felt something shift internally. The fear didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. The pressure was still there, but it no longer felt one-sided. We organized everything, chronologically, methodically. No commentary, no conclusions, just records, surveys, deeds, incorporation filings, policies, meeting minutes. We weren't trying to build a narrative. We were building a file. When the next HOA letter arrived, I read it differently, not as a verdict, but as another data point, another piece of a story that was starting to unravel under scrutiny. I realized then that this wasn't going to end quickly, but it was going to end clearly. Everything they used against me, every notice, every fine, every document, was about to be examined. The end didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. There was no dramatic courtroom speech or last-second revelation. What finally stopped everything was paperwork. Clear, boring, undeniable paperwork. The first official response came from the county recorder's office. Not a ruling, just confirmation. The lien had been reviewed and flagged as unsupported. There was no recorded covenant tying my property to the HOA, no valid chain of authority, no legal mechanism that allowed them to attach my home to their enforcement process. Without that foundation, the lien had no standing. It was invalid. That single determination changed everything. Once the lien collapsed, the fines collapsed with it. Every penalty was built on the assumption that the HOA had authority over my property. When that assumption failed, the rest followed. The letters slowed, then stopped. The inspections ended without announcement, as quietly as they had begun. No one came to the fence with a clipboard anymore. No new notices appeared on the gate. The foreclosure language disappeared entirely. The HOA attempted to reframe the situation at first. There were mentions of administrative errors and miscommunications. Nothing dramatic, nothing admitting fault outright. Just a subtle retreat. But behind the scenes, things were unraveling faster than they could control. The boundary issue forced their hand. A structure, sitting partially on land they didn't own, raised questions they couldn't ignore or delay. It required action. Surveys don't argue. Maps don't negotiate. Either something is where it's allowed to be, or it isn't. At the same time, other homeowners began coming forward. Quietly at first, then with more confidence. Once it became clear that pushing back didn't automatically result in punishment, people found their voices. Files were opened, records requested, meetings questioned. The board changed, members resigned. Some stepped down citing personal reasons, others simply stopped attending. Without the authority they had relied on, without the assumption that no one would challenge them, the structure that supported their pressure tactics weakened. Eventually, the HOA announced it would suspend enforcement actions pending internal review. Not long after that, it dissolved, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association with no enforcement power, no fines, no liens, just coordination, maintenance, communication. No one celebrated loudly. There was relief, not triumph, a sense that something heavy had finally been set down. For me, the outcome was simple. The lien was formally removed. Every fine associated with it was dismissed. My property records were corrected to reflect what they had always shown: independent ownership, no HOA authority. The house stayed where it had always been, grounded in the same land it had occupied for more than a century and a half. I walked through the rooms again, this time without the weight in my chest. The house felt the same, solid, quiet, patient, like it had been waiting for this moment. What stayed with me wasn't anger, it was clarity. None of this happened because of a single bad rule or one aggressive letter. It happened because systems depend on silence, on people assuming someone else knows better, on fatigue, on fear, on the idea that challenging authority is too expensive, too complicated, too risky. What stopped it wasn't power or money, it was documentation. Questions. Time spent reading instead of reacting. Neighbors talking to each other instead of suffering alone. That's the part I think matters most. If you own something, especially something old, something inherited, something that carries history, know its story. Keep its papers. Don't assume that because something looks official it's correct. Authority isn't the same thing as accuracy. Ask questions, ask them calmly, ask them repeatedly if necessary, and pay attention to who is being pressured. It's rarely random. Elderly homeowners, people living alone, those with deep roots but limited resources, historic homes that don't fit neatly into modern systems. These are the first targets when convenience starts to outweigh fairness. This house survived generations because each one took responsibility for it. Not just for the building, but for the truth attached to it. I didn't win anything new. I just protected what was already there. If this could happen to a 155-year-old house, it could happen to anyone.